Hi, I'm Kathryn,
And I'm Jermaine.
and this is our Stats 209 final project, Can We Guess Your Aid? Our project we wanted to investigate if there's a relationship between various factors such as GDP or population and the amount of foreign aid that a country receives. Foreign aid is defined as just the amount of money that a country gets from other countries without the expectation of something in return. And that money can go not just to a country's government, but also to NGOs within the country or within to government contractors within a country.
And our map just shows the different countries that received aid in 2005 as a percentage of the aid received by Iraq, who received the most aid in 2005. So, from our research, we pretty much found that the most important aspect of aid is that it saves lives. A lot of countries rely heavily on the food and the money and all their donations that are given to them to help feed their citizens and to give them hope to continue to go on.
Why this project matters to Jermaine and I specifically, I would say, is just that we view ourselves as global citizens. Um, and as a global citizen, it's important, we believe, to be aware of the conditions that fellow human beings are living in. And aid is one of the most common forms of help that we are able to give other people in the world. And I think that knowing where that where our money goes is important, and this is our project is trying to figure that out. If we could know where our money's going based off of certain indicators that we hear in the news. So the first part of our project was to figure out which countries we wanted to look at. And the way that we went about picking countries was we looked at a ranking of aid in 2014, and we tried to select countries that received um, a spectrum of the aid that was given. So countries that receive a lot of aid and countries that don't receive as much aid. We also tried to get countries from every continent and from a range of countries geographically.
And our map just shows what countries we used and where they are geographically.
Next, we chose the indicators that we wanted to look at to see if there's a relationship there. And I would say that we picked indicators that are kind of like the buzzword indicators that I hear and Jermaine hears most often used in the media to ascertain how well a country's doing. So we have life expectancy, GDP, and GDP per capita, the literacy rate, mortality rate, all very accessible factors, very commonly used.
Yeah, I would consider these like common benchmarks. So when you look at a country, these are probably some of the first places you go to and trying to kind of assess how well this country may be doing in ranks to other countries.
All of our data was collected from the World Bank database.
Yeah, and after taking a look at the data that we got, we determined to make some revisions just based off of what was actually going on in the country. So our first one was China.
One of the countries we wanted initially to include in our data set and ended up excluding was China because of the large population. They skewed all of our data, and we were not able to include them in our model.
And then we also wanted to take a specific note at Afghanistan. They receive a lot of aid in proportion to their population, which which kind of skewed our data a little bit, but it was still useful to point out. And so one of the factors that we kind of looked at as we continued to progress through the model to see if they were really a heavy impact.
Yeah, another note on Afghanistan is for a long section of time they were receiving aid relative to everyone else, like pretty normal. But post 9/11, the amount of aid that the U.S. specifically, gave Afghanistan has increased substantially, which you could see in our data set. And then the last point about our data collection is that we're using a country specific model in the end, but we will get to that in a second.
And so this is our first linear regression. Um, and so in order to determine which variables were the best predictors of international aid, we ended up doing a best subsets model. And from that subsets, the indicators that we decided to use were GDP, GDP per capita, population, life expectancy, and net migration.
You can see when we included those 5 traits, our linear regression summary gave us an R-squared value of 34.11%, which isn't fantastic. On the right-hand side, you can see our normal probability plot, which does show some variation and just says that our data doesn't match a linear model closely.
It's also important to note that we use log of aid instead of just regular aid. It just helps fit our model a little bit better and a lot easier to explain.
So when we were looking at our data, on the left-hand side, you can see a scatter plot of log aid versus GDP where we don't sort for country, and then on the right-hand side, you can see that same graph where we differentiate by country. And it became clear to us, with the help of some statisticians, that the country matters when determining a regression line. So you can see that for the countries in the right-hand plot, on the left-hand side, that their regression or their projection of their country is drastically different from some of the countries that are a little bit more spread out on the graph. And by looking at countries specifically, you're able to get a more accurate guesstimate or determination of what's actually going on with the aid in the country.
I guess it's also important to note that these are just scatter plots of aid versus GDP, but we were seeing this same kind of trend of aid determination being shown in every scatter plot that we did, whether it was mortality rate, net migration, GDP per capita, it was continuously popping up. And so that kind of just gave us the indicator that our model needed to account for country in some way.
So to do that, we then accounted for country, and we included country as one of our predictors. And when we ran a linear regression accounting for country, only using the same 5 characteristics that we used in our original regression, we got an R-squared value of 95.62%, which is significantly higher than the original 34% that we got when we weren't accounting for country.
Yeah, and so the graph shown in this slide is another linear regression. It's important to note that the data may seem a little clumped together compared to the other graph, but this is because they are on the same axes. And this is how we just see that after taking country into account, our data got way closer to the line than it was before. So one of the biggest conclusions we were able to draw from our model was that country is the most influential indicator for aid. And by that, we mean that the best way for a country to predict how much aid they're going to receive is to look at their own indicators and to look at their own history to try to predict what's going to come in the future.
So I think this could speak to a couple of things. Like Jermaine said, it could be that aid is more country specific. I think going off of that, it also speaks to the political nature of aid, and that sometimes aid isn't given based on need, but rather given on political convenience. And using aid strategically, so giving aid to countries where we need an ally in a certain region or that we want to build up a relationship with, whether that country can offer us something to trade or troops. But that seems to be a more common reason to give aid than strict, basic, just need.
And of course, with our model, we had certain sources of error. One of those being the small sample size. Of course, we only used 10 countries originally in our model, and there's a possible chance that because our sample was so small that it could have a lot of error in it, and so that's something to be noted.
Also, our choice of indicators, because country influenced the model so drastically, I think that also could mean that there are indicators that we didn't account for, and we understand that, and perhaps the indicators we chose were not the best ones out there, and going through and doing this again with different indicators I think would be informative.
Of course, it doesn't mean that our indicators were necessarily bad. because our R squared was pretty high when we accounted for country. It just means that, there are possible other descriptors out there that could do a better job. And of course, with our indicators, there were a lot of missing data that we can't really account for. And so, of course, that's going to play a huge role in any model that you have. When you don't have the data there, it's just a missing link.
Also, inaccurate collection, because some of our countries are in a poor area of the world. There's not as much infrastructure available to do accurate surveying. And periodic collection, so for instance, net migration was only collected every 5 years. And again, like how accurate that number is, it's harder to say.
And of course, there were large changes from year to year for some countries. The fact that, there was political upheaval and possible wars are just possible reasons for those changes.
We would just like to thank Professor Kuiper and
Buki for all of their help that they gave us through this entire process, for leading us and guiding us when we were going astray.
Yeah, also the Grinnell College Math and Stats Department for the opportunity to do this work.
So these are just the websites that we use to receive all of our photos that were used in our project.